Jerry Malinowski has had a colorful and important design career. He graduated from the Cleveland Institute of Art in 1961 at the top of his class, and since that time he has worked as a designer for the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan, General Motors in Warren, Michigan, Panasonic Electric Corporation in Tokyo, Japan, and designed a bobsled for the 1989 and 1992 Olympic Winter Games. He has received numerous grants and awards and made a large contribution as an educator at both Syracuse University and the University of Louisiana Lafayette. I have known Jerry as a colleague and friend for close to 15 years, and I can say without a doubt that he has been instrumental in making the quality industrial design program at ULL that exists today. Over the years, I have heard many incredible stories from Jerry. Many of these stories have become lore amongst the ID alumni. When I get together with our ID graduates, the favorites inevitably come up. Some of these stories you will hear today. His stories are amusing, out of the ordinary, and often very educational. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you my friend, talented designer, and loyal colleague, Jerry Malinowski.
Good afternoon. It's really great to see all you folks this afternoon on such a wonderful, exciting day. Exciting, exciting, exciting to see all those cars. And what's interesting is that those cars are kind of part of your family. They're part of my family. The DNA, the idea of the DNA title, DNA of the Ford Mustang. I'm going to take you through a journey, and there's going to be a lot of snapshots in time. And hopefully we can begin to clarify the enigma that's associated with this great American icon. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that when we were working on this project, we never realized that it would reach these expectations. It was a matter of, it was a job. It was a 68-hour-a-day job, 68-hour week, I should say, from 8 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night every day, and Saturdays. And it amazes me when I see some of my students complaining about the fact that they've got to do a certain amount of work. Wait till you get out. Wait till you get out. That's all I can tell you. So if I ride you, it's for a reason, okay? The birthplace of the Mustang, Dearborn, Michigan. Motor City's Detroit, Detroit's population was 1.8 million people. It was really kind of an exciting place in terms of, this is the River Rouge plant. And what would happen is that you would get, oops. Is that you would get, on these ore boats would come the iron ore, and it would go through this facility where you would have the rolled steel, and on the other end of the assembly plant would come out a Ford Mustang, or a Ford Falcon, or a Ford Thunderbird, or a Ford Fairlane. And at the end of the assembly line, there was a guy with a rubber mallet. And he would pick up the hood, look at it, whap it, put it down. That's how he adjusted the hood. And then he'd go on the other side of the car, the deck lid, that wasn't quite adjusted. He'd whap that a couple of times, close it, and that's how he did the final adjustment. Absolutely amazing phenomenon to see. You got to see it. You got to go there. I think it's cost you about $15 to do a tour today. Dearborn, Michigan. Detroit was a happening. They made cars. The USA auto industry was #1 in the world, and you had Motown. Think about it. Kids from the inner city making music that was heard all over the world. Phenomenal. Motor City, Motown. Gordy Berry worked for Ford in the Berkeley Lincoln division, and he actually used their quality control plan in his business. Pretty fascinating, think about that. Auto industry contributing to the record industry business. These were my wheels. I cruised up to Ford, about 180 miles from Cleveland, Ohio. I had a 3/4 race cam in this car. Those guys probably know more about it than anybody over there. 3/4 race cam, 294 carburetors, a high-rise manifold, Edelbrock manifold, Mallory ignition with dual points, Stewart Warner, electric fuel pump, headers, and Smitty exhaust. Nothing sweeter than to hear a flathead. If you haven't heard a flathead Ford with Smitty exhaust, you haven't lived. Haven't lived. And I also had a Lincoln Zephyr transmission in this thing with overdrive. I could get 60 out of first, 90 out of second. And I could actually take a 55 Chevy after a while. Okay. 1949 Ford. What's interesting is that about 3 weeks ago, I was talking to Dean Weber. Dean Weber is the head archivist at Ford Motor Company. And I said, Dean, I'm looking for some photographs of the Falcons that were sent to Italy in 1961 and 62. He said, well, I don't know anything about that. You don't know anything about that. Okay. But he said, we had a conversation, and he said, oh, just the other day, somebody's daughter came in and claimed that the father designed the 1949 Ford. He didn't tell me who it was, but I told him who it was. And I says, it's either Dick Khalil or Bob Cotto. And he says, it was Dick Khalil's daughter. And that's kind of a little bit of what I want to talk about today, is that there is a corporate mantra as to what happened, and then there's the reality of what really did happen. And in many cases, the corporate mantra, in some cases, is a fairy tale. And you probably have experienced that if you worked in a large corporation. The Edsel. Disaster for Ford. Absolute disaster. From 1958 to 1960, they recorded a loss of about $2.8 billion in today's money. Now what's interesting, I'm a designer, but I'm talking a lot about sales, and I'm talking a lot about money, right? And if you're a designer and you're designing for manufacturing, that's what you talk about. Is that product going to sell? If it doesn't sell, you're out of business. Right? You're out of business. Now what's happening also is that the Ford Falcon, which is that car in the background, was not selling either. Its sales were projected to be maybe 50% in a year or so. They sold 500,000 units the first year. The Ford Thunderbird, actually, we're looking at the kind of the progenitors of what the Mustang would be. Thunderbird and the Falcon. Robert McNamara, he's on the right. President John F. Kennedy sitting central. Robert McNamara was actually the bean counter of bean counters. He was the president of Ford, held a position for 1 month before he took the job with Kennedy as the Secretary of Defense. This was 1960. He was responsible for the Ford Falcon. Good idea. An affordable car, $100,000 car that weighed 2,400 pounds. Less than $1 a pound, you could buy a Ford Focus. Quite a deal. Try to do that today. All right. Problem is, though, is that he took a job that was paying $25,000 a year now, from a $400,000 job as a Secretary of Defense. He was responsible for the Falcon, and in a sense, he was responsible for the Edsel, because he was in charge. He didn't really want it to go through once he understood what was going on, but it happened. Now you got this guy running the office of, what, Secretary of Defense. Pretty scary, isn't it? People that you put in power, and then you got us involved with Vietnam, which was another disaster. And what's interesting and what's kind of sad is that Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and I would actually work on his car after his assassination, which is a whole other story into itself. And actually, the DNA of the Lincoln Continental is partially in the Mustang, so I have to talk about it. I'm going to go back a year from 61 to 1960. I was at General Motors. For your architects out there, you probably really understand the architecture of architect Earl Cernan. This was an incredible place to be. It was like being in kind of a fantasy land, Disneyland in a sense. Beautiful campus, incredible campus. One of the things that I did, they asked us, you have the opportunity to move Washington, D.C. I moved them into the Everglades. And I had to design a car, and I designed an amphibious vehicle which would travel on land and water. The wheels would rotate into a 90-degree position and land, and it would take water in at this point and expel it out the rear like a jet ski. Only this was like 1960. Now, what was really kind of exciting about General Motors is that they have a history that goes way back, and they had a lot of interesting characters, just like Ford did. A lot of interesting characters. I used to see this old Chevy pull up into the parking lot, 1933 Chevy. And I said, I got to meet that guy who drives that, right? Because I had a 1933 Pontiac, and I still have it. 1933 Pontiac, 1933 Chevy. There's a correlation here as what happens in the auto industry. So as I'm talking to this guy, he introduces himself, but I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Pontiac was having a rough time. In fact, they almost dissolved their division. And there was a guy by the name of Frank Hershey, who was one of the designers. He was probably one of the key designers. And he pulled this off. This has a beautiful front end on it. The grill shell is like a Bentley. It's kind of a takeoff of a Bentley. In fact, the 34 would have that quality. But notice the louvers in the hood, the skirted fenders. This was 1933. The windshield was canted. Also, the grill, the whole front grill is beginning to be canted. Prior to that, it was stationed, it was straight up. So they're pushing the idea of aerodynamics now. In terms of a production car. Although it was happening on a big scale prior to this, but 33 was like a big year for the blossoming of aerodynamics in automobiles. So who was that old guy that was driving that car? You know who Zora Arkus built off of? He's the guy. He's the father of Corvette engineering. And what was really exciting about this conversation is that I'm this young guy kind of talking to this guy, and everybody in the Ford, in the GM Stag is saying, how the hell did Malinowski get to talk to Zora Arkus Bunko? Well, this was the combination. They started talking cars. And he said, yeah, the body of your car is the same as mine, basically. He said, the fender line is slightly different, the grill is different. You have a straight 8 engine, I have a 6-cylinder engine. He knew exactly what I was driving. That Pontiac had a straight 8 flathead, beautiful running little car. And its sales, the sales of that car would save Pontiac division. So this guy, you would hear him drive these cars around the track. They had a track over there at campus, Virginia campus. So he'd be testing Corvettes. What a lifestyle this guy has. Now, one of the interesting conversations that we used to have is a friend of mine had a 55 Ford Speedster, and we used to race this thing. But we actually raced it on a track, but we raced it more on the city streets of Cleveland, which was not a cool thing to do, but we had a lot of fun doing it late at night. Actually used to lay on the street and watch how we cornered, how we took the corners. Talk about being crazy, right? And I'm sure some of you folks have done that yourself, right? I mean, I've talked to some of these guys in the Mustang Club, and I'll tell you, they've got some stories. Okay, the Chevrolet Corvair, are you familiar with that? Chevrolet Corvair. Ralph Nader claimed it was unsafe at any speed. He wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. You had to have 26 pounds of air in the rear tires, and I think it was like 15 pounds of air in the front tires. Think about that. How often do you check your tire pressure? Everybody raises their hand, right? Nobody raised their hand, right? And it was a rear engine. It was a rear engine car. What happens with a rear engine car? There's a propensity for it to oversteer because the weight bias, the engine's in the rear. Now here's the thing that's amazing, is Duntov solved the problem of oversteer on the Porsche 356. The Porsche, because he used to race Porsches. On the early Porsches, they didn't have a stabilizer bar. A stabilizer bar would have helped having a stabilizer bar up front. And this also had swing axles, like the old Porsches. So, funny things, the geometry of the car was pretty weird. But that's kind of what made it exciting to drive, right? But anyhow, Ford panicked. Why did they panic? Well, they panicked because of this little Monza here. They made the Corvair Monza had bucket seats. Bucket seats. And it was the bucket seats that made this little car sell. It's amazing. And the interior. And the fact that it had a turbocharger. It had a 4-speed. So they panicked. Because it started, I'll sell this car. Pretty frumpy looking, isn't it? Pretty frumpy looking little car. It was a better car, actually, than the Corvair. But it needs some help. Projected sales down 50%. That's pretty serious. If you have a business, think about it. Really serious. So what happens is that, and I'm kind of moving out of a time frame. I'm showing you snapshots out of time, but they're not in a sequence because in many cases there is no sequence in industry. You do things because you have to do them. You don't necessarily have an itinerary that you have to go by, and that changes constantly. And what's happening here is that we took that frumpy Falcon and we made the Falcon Sprint. I worked on the interior of this car in 1962 at the latter part when I left the Mustang program. And that was the interior. Pretty hot, right? Bucket seats, 4-speed. Had a little 260 V8, little small block V8. Now here, this is a funny story. See that console? What about that console? Well, just think about it. You took your sweetie out. She sure as hell didn't want to sit on that console. And we got more complaints about that console than you can believe. And one of the things I did is I padded it. We did a version that we patented. But what happens is that even with those changes, the Falcon only sold 15,000 units of that model. So it wasn't enough to bring it up. Even with all the pizzazz and fun to drive, it still didn't bring it up to the quality. I just want to take you through a little bit of what the styling center was. They call it styling. They didn't call it design, they called it styling. But it was design. Henry would inherit his father's paradigm. What would that be? People like General Motors. Henry II was the son of Edsel Ford. Edsel was the son of Henry Ford. And Henry Ford and his sons in reign would have the final say-so of everything that came out of the Ford industry. They would have to sign off on it. He had to convince Henry. He was the guy. So what happened is that they really wanted to be more GM-like, and it goes back to Edsel. So Edsel would hire Bob Gregory in 1931 and patterned it after the studios of Harley Earl. Harley Earl was a dictator. They used to dictate the design. Called it color, they did color and light. So the studio pattern was pretty much patterned off of GM's design system. And so what we had is we had Ford, Lincoln was there, but Mercury wasn't there yet. Mercury would come a little later. But when I was there, we had the Ford Lincoln Mercury design studios, we had a production studio, we had a pre-production studio, advanced studio, and then there was a truck studio, which is by itself. A production studio is that you have the car that's designed and it's ready to go in production. It normally takes about 2 years from ideation, concept, to finalize, to get into production. It takes 2 years. So you're working with product planners, you're working with engineers, you're working with a lot of different people. And the pre-production studio is kind of an idea studio. Is that you don't have to worry about the engineers telling you can't make it. And engineers will always tell you, and I see an engineer smiling right now, is that you can't make it. And I can tell you one thing is that in many cases I used to butt heads with engineers because they say you can't make it, and a few times I'd go to a junkyard and pull a part from another company and say, you can't make this bumper section? Pontiac's been doing it for 3 years. That's what would happen. But you had to fight for it. You had to fight for anything that you wanted to design and get into production. You had to fight for it. And then the advanced studio is that, like, you are out there flying. You're flying. No holds barred. It's all blue sky. Maybe sometimes very dark sky. And sometimes a lot of sunshine, right? Lee Iacocca, you've heard of that guy? You've heard of Henry Ford. Would you trust any of those guys with your dog? Think about it. Would you trust any of those guys? In fact, they hated each other. They hated each other. Iacocca would eventually get fired. Iacocca gets all the credit for the Mustang. And he was really head of product planning. But he really didn't design anything. He didn't design anything. He was a salesman. He had an engineering background, but he was a salesman and he was in product planning. So the way it works is that if you're head of something, you're the guy. You're the guy that designed it. Now this really gets to be an interesting story. You've probably heard the fact that Henry Ford wanted to buy a Ferrari. Enzo Anselmo Ferrari, right? He's the man. He's the guy. He's the big guy. He's the big kahuna. If you look at his record of wins on the international racing scene, Ferrari was the guy. Henry Ford, and actually Enzio, the story comes out that Enzio was actually toying with Henry. He was toying with Henry. He wasn't going to sell. He had no intention to sell Ferrari. Are you serious? The guy's life, put his life into racing and some of the most incredible cars in the world. He's going to sell it for Ford for $10 million. Scuderia Ferrari. But Capolino Rampante. Capolino Rampante is the prancing horse. That's the branding of Ferrari. Prancing horse. Scuderia Ferrari is Ferrari stables. Stable your horses. Right? And Count Francesco Baracca. What a name, right? Count Francesco Baracca. Well, the story goes, in fact, the story was told to me by Alex Tremulous, the guy that designed the 47 Tucker. This guy was full of stories. This guy was just an incredible person. You can see the Capolino Rampante on the aircraft. He's wearing riding boots. Look, he's riding trousers. That was part of the cavalry. The aircraft, World War I aircraft, these guys were part of the cavalry. And he was the ace, the Italian ace. He shot down 34 enemy planes. Unfortunately, in 1918, he was strafing trenches. And they shot him down. He had 34 kills. He was the World War I ace of Italy in terms of pilot. So in his SPAD 7, Mark 7, he gets shot down, and his mother goes to Ferrari and says, Signor Ferrari, could you put the Capolino Rampante on your car? That's the story. That's the story. Now, the story on this isn't as romantic, I can tell you that. It's not as romantic. But I had a little something to do with this. Well, Henry's going to have a horse on his car regardless if Ferrari sells it or not. That's the moral of the story. He's going to have a horse on the car. And he's going to eventually beat Ferrari. Okay? Now, there's a lot of things that are flying around. What is the history? What is the history? Where did it get its name? Well, if you look up there, Allegro, Aventura, Torino, T5, Thunderbird, those were all potential names for what we know as the Mustang. The name wasn't really picked. Wasn't picked yet. And the T51 Mustang, and then you have the wild horses. In fact, the wild horses are on the inside of your interior. If you look at the 65 Mustang, you can see the beautiful little kind of a vignette of horses in the seating. This is where part of this emblem came from. This was one of my first sketches of a Mustang, 1962, and it was, we didn't even know what the hell the car was going to be. They didn't even tell us wheelbase, they didn't tell us anything. It would be a two-seater. And I had these racing stripes running along the side of the car. Usually the racing stripe is running longitudinally to the center line of the car. And Bob McGuire, he was the chief. We had chiefs. We had chiefs at studios. We had a lot of chiefs. We had more chiefs than we had Indians. And Bob said, and also Don De La Rosa, he was an executive stylist. Chief and executive stylist. He had all these titles. And you would actually get if you were really a high chief, you had a sterling silver water pitcher. And if you were an executive, you would have a crystal water pitcher. And if you were a manager, you would have a cast glass pitcher. Right? Can you see the hierarchy of the corporation? But anyhow, he says, why don't you put that into an emblem? Because we needed an emblem on the car. We were starting to develop the Mustang. I'm going to take you through that. So I did an emblem, and we had emblem on a car for a while. An emblem, it's America. It's an American car, red, white, blue. Phil Clark sat next to me, and at some point thereafter, he was given the job to come up with a horse. They merged. That's how that emblem came up. Phil did the horse, and I did the emblem. But you're never going to get the real story of what took place. Remember the story about Ferrari, Ford wanting to buy Ferrari? Well, this whole idea of a Mustang, developing the Mustang is a two-seater. We start with a two-seater. And, but really, if you look at a birdcage Maserati on your left, basically a 2-liter car, and it has a aluminum tube space frame. This has an aluminum tube space frame. The Ferrari has a steel space frame with an aluminum body. And the engine is mid-engine. It's not rear engine. So you have a lower polar movement. You don't have that bias to swing out and oversteer. So it has a really good handling characteristic, and that becomes the trend in race cars now. Ferrari didn't want to buy into it. He still liked the horses up front. But it was proven on the track that the mid-engine was the way to go. So if I put together this comparative chart, and if you look at it, Ferrari, 2-liter engine, Mustang, 2-liter engine. But the Ferrari is developing almost twice as much horsepower. Right? Twice as much horsepower. There's only 1.3 inches difference in the wheelbase. Now you can't get any closer than that, but yes you can. Because when we came out with the Mustang, a couple of years later, GM came out with the what? Camaro. 108-inch wheelbase, right? Mustang's 108-inch wheelbase. I mean, it's like you copy. You want to be competitive, you've got to copy. So really, the idea of that sports car, there's all kinds of stuff floating around where it came from. It really comes from the fact that Ferrari had this. And Henry Ford is going after Ferrari. Eventually, will pick up Carroll Shelby. And that's a whole other story in itself. Well, anyhow, if we add all this up, the Ferrari is a superior car. And there was no intention for Ford to ever build that car. It was a dog and pony show. We weren't told that. You don't tell the guys that are designing this stuff that it's a dog and pony show. You tell them that this is serious business, right? It's a dog and pony show. And the dog and pony show was very successful. So, I'm designing coupes, fastbacks, enclosed cars because they do go faster on the track. You don't have the drag that you do in an open car. And really, this would actually become the development of the GT40. The Mustang one would become developed into the GT40. So these sketches would now evolve into play. So as you're sketching and ideating, they go into a clay model. The model is full scale. Full scale, sometimes we do quarter scale. It's really a beautiful method of working with an idea, put it into play. They still do it today. Still do it today. Only they CNC the basic model, they CNC it. And it takes about 5 days to CNC a full-size car. And then it takes about 4 more days for guys to go in there and clean it up. Now, what's really fascinating about living in today's world is I'm talking to Dean Weber now, the archivist at Ford Motor Company. I'm actually talking to him on the telephone and I'm on the computer, and he starts sending me these images from the archives. That's pretty exciting. Talking to the head archivist of Ford Motor Company, and he's sending me these images. Pretty exciting. The guys in the suits, those are the chiefs. Notice the casualness of the cigarette. Everybody smoked cigarettes back there. So what happens is that after the development of the clay, the engineering, and Roy Lund was the head engineer. Interesting guy. He actually worked for Aston Martin in England. And he flew for the RAF. Really sharp guy. In fact, I really threw one at him because my last year in school, I found an Aston Martin. It was for a derelict Aston Martin. It was in a kind of a derelict car lot. I could have bought it for $1,100. I would have put a Corvette engine in it or a Chevy small block in it, but I didn't have $1,100. But I threw that story at him, and he kind of cringed a little bit because that had a beautiful double overhead cam, 6-cylinder engine in it. Okay, the 100 days. The 100 days has to do with taking it from the claim model to the engineering that was done. It goes to Trutman and Barnes in California, which is a custom shop, and they make the car. They make the Mustang 1. They only make one working model. Then they made a fiberglass model. They made 2 cars. So what I'm going to show you here is the DNA of that car is really going to come out of Thunderbird. So you can see the engine is back here. This is the engine. That's the mid-engine. It's not back here like it would be on a Corvair. The engine is up here. It has a steel tubing frame, just like the Ferrari. It has an aluminum body. But here's some of the things that I brought with me from Thunderbird. This was a Thunderbird Roadster, 62 Roadster. And if you look at the Mustang 1, you can see that this is coming out of the 64 Thunderbird right here. The dual kind of panels. And then it integrates into the seating. And this is a whole story unto itself. I got a fun story on that. But it's kind of bullet nose. And the 62 to 3, 1, 2, 3 Thunderbird was called the Bullet Bird. And then I will show you some of the stuff that I worked on shortly. Here's the Dog and Pony Show. The Dog and Pony Show, the car goes to Watkins Glen for the Grand Prix, 1962 Grand Prix, October 7th, 1962. And who's driving it? The Dan Gurney. Around the track, driving this car. October 7th, 1962. So 100 days they had this working model. That's phenomenal when you think about it. It's a little shop. Little shop. They hammered out those panels. They were all hammered out. They were, I mean, it was amazing. It had a little 4-cylinder Thomas engine in it, a V4. Same engine that was used in the later Saabs, probably into the 90s. Same engine. And they could have gotten over 200 horsepower out of that car. This car didn't even have disc brakes on the rear, as the Ferrari had. Ferrari had a 5-speed transaxle, this had a 4-speed transaxle. This is the fun part. You've got to have a little sex in the presentation. All right. This is Henry Ford. And McDonald Ford. What's interesting is that when I was working in the advanced studio, Bob McGuire, the guy that asked me to mock up the emblem, he says, "Jerry, you can draw figures." He said, "I need some opera program covers for Mrs. Ford. What the hell are you talking about? You need some covers. Anne McDonald Ford, her whole being of life had to do with bringing the New York Metropolitan Opera to Detroit. That was her whole existence. I mean, these people were like royalty. The Ford family. This is royalty. So I did Boris Goodenough, right? I did a series of 6 covers for her, and I would actually get to meet this lady on several occasions. Very gracious person. Did a whole series of these covers. It was kind of fun. Wasn't a lot of time spent on it. But guess what? Little did Anne McDonald Ford know Henry was having an affair with this lady. Right? They would divorce, they would get a divorce eventually. And what's interesting, I'm just a young guy here, and she's talking about Henry and those Italian cars, right? And you don't put these things together, but after a while the word gets around that Henry's fooling around. But he's using the company to fool around. Okay, he's using the company. Okay, what happens here is that I'm sitting in this chair right here. Okay, I'm driving a 1950 Jaguar XK120, 120 mile an hour car right from the factory. I could smell the castor bean oil Castro because the English version of a car weeps oil. We all know that. And the transmission is hotter than hell, so my right leg is being roasted, right? And I'm driving from Detroit, Michigan to Cleveland, Ohio. I'm talking to Charlie Harbison, who's working at Chrysler. He's one of my friends. He's working at Chrysler. And all of a sudden, I'm doing about 80 miles an hour or so, and the lights go out. Did you ever? I see people smiling because they know that English cars. They call Lucas the Prince of the Night of Darkness, or Prince of Darkness, right? Lucas ignition. But the thing that's interesting is that we miss this. We miss the idea of the olfactory senses, the sounds associated with feeling the smell of oil, the smell of rotting leather. I mean, those are important things to experience when you're driving that car. The cars today are just too damn antiseptic. They actually don't let you enjoy that driving sensation, the experience of driving. And that has to come back to the product. When they bring it back to the product, I think they're going to have something. Okay, but what's happening here is we're looking at proportional transfer. That steering wheel and that bench seat in the Ford Thunderbird is pulled off of that car right there on your right. Long hood, short deck, horsepower in front. It's an icon, it's a symbol. Proportionality is important. Why do you always see cars usually drawn from the side? That's usually the first way to start doing a car design, from the side. Now this is another enigma. The 57 Ford Thunderbird was outselling Corvettes 27-1. Think about that. 27-1, and they took it out of production. Corvette's still out there, right? Corvette's still a benchmark. Became a world benchmark. It had good leadership. It had good leadership back there with Duncombe. Ford was always looking for somebody else. In fact, they would bring a lot of GM employees into Ford. Part of their history. Look at where they are today. They can't even design an ignition switch, right? Think about it. Largest corporation in the world. And where are they? They were the largest corporation in the world. They were the top country in the world. They aren't anymore. Okay, so this car is outselling, and so I'm asking myself, working on the Mustang 1, what the hell are we designing a two-place car for? You guys just put it out of commission. What, are we going to revive it? Does it make any sense? Who's in charge? Who's in charge? Okay, so here's where some of the drama begins right here. The 62 Thunderbird. Look at the seat pillar on this baby. Look at the mess. Could you imagine sitting back there? Anybody? You wouldn't want to sit back there, would you? And so I used to go back, and I went back to the 55, and I said, that's where I want to start with, you know. You're asking me to design a 64, I'm going to start with this. I'm going to start with the 55. Some of my first sketches on the Thunderbird, and I used to like to use wash. Freedom of wash. Quality of a brush. Part of the experience of drawing, of using media, different media, is that sometimes just the accidental wash that takes place with the water reveals an interesting beginning of a form or direction. Doesn't happen on a computer. Doesn't happen on a computer. Even a pencil. So one of the things I always did is I would always experiment. I loved to experiment. And I didn't want my drawings to look like everybody else's. I didn't want it to look like everybody else's. It was kind of a paradigm. There was a paradigm coming from Art Center School. They all looked the same. You didn't even have to sign them. You could say it was Art Center School. And part of the idea is when you did a drawing, an ideation, you put it up on the wall. It was called wallpaper. It was called a wallpaper. And the big guys would walk through and they say, hey, I like that. I like that. Let's do it. Let's put it in play. Now what was happening is that, remember the big C-pillar? The massive C-pillar, the fact that you're inside a cavern? One of my thoughts were, let's get some fresh air into there and let's celebrate the fresh air. That was the whole idea of the side scoop, was getting fresh air into the back of that. I didn't care how it was engineered. I mean, it's got some engineering problems. But that wasn't my problem at the time. And I even put a stainless steel cover over it to get their attention. I sure as hell wouldn't normally do that kind of thing. But that's what you had to do, is you had to make your drawings look appealing to somebody out there. And you got to remember is that the guy that was head of Ford, his name was George Walker, and they called him the Cellini of chrome. The Cellini of chrome. Cellini has to do with some artist, I think a Renaissance artist. But the guy loved chrome. He put chrome. In fact, the cars of the 50s were just plastered with chrome. Tons of chrome. So really, this becomes the birth of that Mustang side scoop. That's where it happened. Came out of the Ford Thunderbird pre-production studio. The idea of proportioning it, the long hood, more taut, upright C-pillar. Okay, now getting back to the story of Henry Ford. This story is I've never even seen it ever told. They sent 5 Ford Falcons to Italy. These guys, these guys right here, Bertone, Pininfarina, Michelotti, Bengali, Gia. These were the guys that designed the cars for Ferrari. These were the designers that designed the cars for Ferrari. They gave them a contract to take that Ford Falcon and do something with it. Make it look like a Ferrari, but a Ferrari that we could sell for $2,500, you know? Well, that's why Henry was doing a lot of flying back and forth to Italy, right? but it was an absolute failure. It was kind of a joke. In fact, we kind of got the word from management. They said, you guys can't design cars. And we said, what? We're putting in 60 hours a week and you're telling us, what the hell are you paying us for, right? We can't design cars. And we laughed like hell when these cars came back. Why? Well, for one thing is that they weren't particularly very good looking. They really weren't good looking. And when they sent them to the paint shop, the product planner said, we got to have them either eggshell white, pink, salmon pink, turquoise, you know, the colors of the late 50s, early 60s. They were all painted black or Alfa Romeo maroon. Right? A car that's painted black has a tendency to look more svelte. Right? You paint it white, it's going to look. They look like Easter eggs. They look like Easter eggs. And when they stripped the paint, it was full of Bondo. All this beautiful hand-formed Italian craftsmanship was full of Bondo. So it wasn't there. They didn't deliver. Now, Henry being Henry, and his love for Italian cars, he had a Ferrari and Maserati garage in his stable at all times. That's what he used to drive. You can see him drive it, you know. When he'd come to Fort Stein, he'd be driving a Maserati. He'd never driven a Ford Model. He'd be driving one of the. His wife drove a Lincoln. She had a blue Lincoln Continental convertible. So what is it all about? Getting back to Maserati, Ferrari. This is not the best example for that kind of nose. So I got the message. Some early sketches on Mustang. Very Maserati-esque, right? And the idea of the side scoop. Genesis is Thunderbird. Fastback. This guy's feeling a little bit of rubber back there. Now, one thing I'd like to have you do when you go outside and look at that beautiful black Mustang of Dave. Dave has a beautiful black fastback. In fact, he just took he just took number one in the show appropriate. Just look at that voluptuous form of that fastback. It's kind of a slightly different language to the rest of the body shell. Well, there's a reason for it. And if you look at these cars right here, some of these beautiful cars of the 30s, they had to maintain a specific radius to keep the sheet metal from oil canning. Right? So it became an aesthetic. The manufacturing process dictated a specific curvature, and there was a continuity. If I take you out into the car lot today and I look at some of these new cars where you got a completely molded plastic front bumper, the language between sheet metal and bumper, it's totally alien. Several languages going on, no continuity. So that's where part of the beauty came in, was an understanding of the manufacturing process and materials of how you make something. And you had limitations. You always have limitations. So the voluptuousness of that fastback, just take a look at the way that curvature is there, and even the side view. So when I did my sketches, I was thinking about that. Bob Gregory was the guy that did that. Bob Gregory was an interesting guy. He was a nautical draftsman. And he headed the program for Ford up to the 40s, 40, maybe 47, someplace in And Edsel Ford realized quality. Edsel Ford had a really good sense of quality. So for those cars that came out in the 30s were really phenomenal. Okay, so this date here is 8/16/62. That's a clay model. That's a full-size clay model. That's a full-size clay. Those Mustangs out there are all in clay, just like this clay model. And they put a film of, they call it die knock, and they squeegee it on. Just a film, looked like paint. And they had foil on the chrome strips. So, within a very few short months, this whole Mustang program was pretty much over as far as the direction of what the car would be. Some of the inherited DNA from the roofs. 55 Lincoln, look at the Lincoln. 55 Thunderbird, and look at the Mustang. There's a definite family DNA resemblance. We've got both of these cars outside. Both of these models outside. So the basic car sold for about $23.68. I saw them advertised when I was living in Detroit. I saw them advertised in '64 for $1,900. You could buy a brand new Mustang, 6-cylinder, $1,900, 3-speed on the column. Hell of a lot of car for that. And then you had the Shelby Mustang Fastback, which is almost double. Almost double. But here's where the magic came in. Because remember I told you the Edsel sold 1,500 cars that year in 1960. The first day of sales, April 17, 1964, 24,000 cars. First day, 24,000 cars. Mustang, the Falcon was now going down the tubes. They had to do something quick. They had to do something. So this is a real muscle car right here. I mean, this is a real muscle car right here. I mean, 289 V8, hypo K-code, 271 horsepower. You could do your shopping pretty quick. Get to the pretty quick. Okay, a car is a highly complex design problem. So who really designed the Ford Mustang? Who designed it? You know? And I got a lot of names up there I didn't even put on there. These guys right here, these are all management. These guys right here, well actually right here, had to do more with the Mustang 64 and a half. And then I also worked on a 61 with these three guys right here. And Roy Lund was the head engineer. He also had sub-engineers that worked with him too. Those guys are never credited either. And then there's the Clay Modeler. There's the Clay Modeler. What about those guys, right? Those guys made it a reality. They took your drawings and they put it into reality. And many times you'd pick up the clay tool and you'd say, well, this is what I really want. You know? But those guys were good. Those guys were good. This is Dave Dore's 65. Let's top and back. Now, what I did is I put together a comparative chart here. So if we look at the 65 Falcon, or the 60 Falcon, I should say, and the 65 Mustang, 64 and a half Mustang, you can see the 51-inch high roof line versus 54, and you can see where the hood, it gets to be slightly longer. Oops. You see the hood is slightly longer and the deck is pretty much about the same. So we gained that much more as far as the hood. And the wheelbase now is 108 inches. Now here's a story. If you're the king, and the king could do no wrong, and Henry was the king, is he made a decision when he was looking at the car. He said, I'd like to see that back seat an inch wider. They made it an inch wider. This is also interesting, the Mustang versus the Thunderbird. The Mustang is actually an inch shorter than the two-seat 55 Thunderbird. The proportions even make it look even more stealth. It's amazing what that will do, you know? Just the slightest detail. Another interesting story is what happens in 1961. You've heard of a company called Philco Corporation? Some of you are young guys, probably. Philco. You work for Philco? Oh. Philco was #1 for 30 years in sales. Philco actually was responsible for the transistor. Philco was responsible for the telescopic antenna that went on a car, 1934. Philco was the Apple of its day. And they went bankrupt. Why did they go bankrupt? Because of that television set right there. Ridiculous. How does a multi-million-dollar corporation go bankrupt because of a bad decision? It was a black and white television set for one, and color was like everyday normal. Okay? But anyhow, remember this, is that one's failure is another one's opportunity. I've seen that all my life, and I've had a lot of failures too. And I think I've taken some of my failures and I made them into opportunities, making it better, making something better out of it. But in many cases, this guy, Henry Ford, he was an opportunist, and he bought that company for $80 million, a $300 million company. He also invested 300 plus, he invested money into Ford of Europe stock, buys Philco, and he buys all the life. And I use this as an example. This is a bobsled that I had worked on for the '92 Olympics. The Soviets beat us by 200ths of a second. Can you count 200ths of a second? That was one of my failures, 200ths of a second. And this was a '92 edition. It would be the most aerodynamic sled ever tested by Boeing, and I felt good about that. So I did make something happen, even though I did have a failure, And I want to talk about this guy just briefly, Alex Tremulous, the Tucker designer. This guy was a fantastic person, tremendous car designer, and he was eventually fired by Ford. They fired him. He leaves Ford and he says, well, screw you guys. You don't listen about aerodynamics. He was an advocate of aerodynamics. And this is a 90 horsepower vehicle that travels 245 miles an hour to get the land record speed in the early 60s, 64, 65, someplace in there. In fact, I was working in Japan and I picked up a hot rod magazine and I remember, my God, Alex did it. He broke the record. He's proving his aerodynamics. The aerodynamics work. But the story behind this also is that the guy that was actually driving this thing crashed it at 270 miles an hour. Tumbled for a mile on the Bonneville Salt Flat. Tumbled for a mile. His restraining straps broke. He's restrained by restraining straps. Keep his hands from going out of the cockpit in case he crashes. And he literally almost tore his arm off. They flew him to a medical facility. There was a air base nearby. They put him back together. After his rehabilitation, You go back and you break the world record. These guys are crazy. They are crazy. But it takes to be a little crazy to make things happen. Right? A little crazy. So Ford buys Philco, and what's interesting is that they say, hey, Jerry, we'd like to have you do some work for Philco now as a refrigerator. The handle off that is from a Thunderbird that I was working on. And what does that remind you of? It's a hood of a car, isn't it? And it's a structural element. It stiffens that whole thing. I think it's kind of cool myself. So we designed ranges, television sets, and I even put Ford in space. And eventually Ford would be in space. And I had models hanging from the ceiling. In fact, what was interesting is Alex, he was head of a studio, and he says, what do you want to do, Jerry? They're now asking me what I wanted to do. I thought that was great. They're asking me what I wanted to do. I said, I'd like to put Ford into space, Alex. This guy's a legend right here. Okay, so we have Shelby and the Shelby Cobra, and you're going to see Shelby Cobras out there. And this car is a hybrid. It's an AC Bristol English car with an aluminum body and an anemic engine. So Shelby, and they're having problems, so Shelby says, opportunity. He goes over there and he convinces them that he should be buying bodies and fitting them with a Ford engine, Ford small block engine. GM doesn't want to sell them an engine, but Ford will sell them an engine. What's that a deal with agriculture? And the birth of Shelby Cobra. That car is valued today at $18 million. This state, it's the #1 first car. And it had originally had a 221 cubic inch engine in it. And there's a story behind that, is that the original flathead was 221 cubic inches. That's what I had in my Mercury right there. I had this setup, but I couldn't afford aluminum heads, so I just milled them, had a mill. And hot setup, first engine, a V8 production engine that was affordable by the common working person. Prior to that, you had to be in the range of being able to own a Packard or a Cord. There was something out of the price range of the average person, working person. So this little engine here would be in production from 1932 to 1953. And it was like the benchmark of engines for racing, backyard mechanics, etc. And it's the sweetest sounding engine you want to hear with those spinning plastic. And it all happened back here with this 32 Ford Roadster. That was the first year it came out. That was part of Etzel's doing. The old man Ford, he didn't want anything to do it. He didn't even want to change it, go from a Model T to a Model A. So it took his son Etzel to make it happen. Now, what's really fascinating is you start looking at the DNA of pulling the DNA of things together, is that this guy right here, you all know Buckminster Fuller. In fact, I met Buckminster Fuller in 1968. I was at a conference, and I was actually I was a guest of honor based on designing a wood exhibit and all the work associated with it. And we were on stage. I watched the crowd. This guy talked for about 3.5 hours nonstop. Nobody left the room. The guy was unbelievable. Nobody left the room. But he's the guy that is credited with the triangulated steel tube space frame, of which we used on the Mustang 1. Goes back to 1933. And this guy, Vincenzo Lancia, the 1922 Lancia Lambda, is the first car to use the unibody system, of which is out there on those Mustangs. Those Mustangs are basically a unibody car. They do not have a frame as we know it. They don't have a ladder back frame or a frame with rails. It's all basically made of sheet metal, heavy sheet metal. And it gives you a much stronger structural vehicle. So getting back to this idea of Carroll Shelby gets on board, and he doesn't like Ferrari, he doesn't like General Motors, and he's going to beat Corvette. Now what's interesting is that little Ford Flathead that you guys have in those beautiful Mustangs out there weighs about 100 pounds less than that Chevy Corvette. It's a light engine. And so what is it all based on? Why is Shelby winning? He takes an aluminum body car that weighs 2,000 pounds, eventually puts like 271 horsepower in it. He's just wiping out Corvettes. Right? So, isn't that much more resembling what took place with the Ford Mustang, the mid-engine, right? Mid-engine. Enclosed body, enclosed body. And what's happening is that in '66, the Le Mans, Carroll Shelby, he prepped the cars for Ford. And the racing team, McLaren and Amon won first, but they came in first, second, and third. Ford came in first, second, and third. And they said, hey, Mr. Ferrari, you know? So that was kind of part of the American dream, making it happen, making it happen. If you want to make it happen, you can make it happen. Now, there's a car out there that's right up front. This is really coming out of my archives right here, but in 1964, I did a special, not a Falcon, but a Comet. I'm now in Mercury Comet. And I'm really competing with DeLorean in his GTOs. With the Tempest, that was this competition, that's what we're competing with. They took 6 Comets, and they put a 289 K-code engine in it. They had 6 drivers, and they had, I think, a staff. They had 20 drivers, and they had about 60 guys that were just service staff. They drove those 6 cars at speeds of over 105 miles an hour for 100,000 miles, kind of nonstop, other than just pit stops. So that's phenomenal if you think about it. That little, you could buy it from the factory. It was balanced with a blueprinted engine, the K-code engine. Phenomenal for that period of years. So it was proven in this car. This car has the same platform as the Ford Mustang, as the Ford Falcon. And this is a really funny story here. And the story on this is that I got him to take the chrome off, full of chrome. I said, Art was a big guy. He was rough. He had the worst vocabulary anybody wanted to know. Every other word was a full other word. Working on the clay model, I took all the chrome off of it. It's supposed to be a special car. Collier day, it's hot. I see him, this is overtime after work. I come in, Art's over there, and he's looking at the car, and he's walking around, and he's all upset, and he said, what the hell are you, Malinowski, where the hell's Malinowski? I said, I'm watching you, Art. I said, what's the problem? He says, what the hell did you do to this car? I said, Art, I just took all the chrome off. I said, you want to make this special, right? We used to do that with our cars as kids. We took all the chrome off, right? Clean it up, show the body. I had a thing fast in my hand. I said, well, think of it as a beautiful Rubens painting. And I took it further. I said, think of it as a beautiful young lady loosely dressed. And that got to him. It really got to him. And we didn't we got rid of all the chrome, you know. So, looking at this car, it's a stretch wheelbase. It's the same running gear as those cars out there. In fact, that car is out there. 1965 is out there. There's a gentleman here with that car. You're the driver. It's a hot car, right? It's a hot rod. It's got a supercharger on it. That didn't come from the factory like that. So the wheelbase goes from 114. It goes from 109 to 114, and this was wash and watercolor, just to show you. And then this was the last of the cars I worked on that platform. It was a '66 Comet, and I kind of directed that whole program. That's what that car looked like in production. Notice not a lot of chrome on it. And then again, it goes now from 114 to 116 inches because people wanted more space. They wanted more room. They wanted to be able to put their mother-in-law, the kids in the back seat. So you just take the platform and you stretch it. How far can you stretch it? You know? They stretch it pretty far. So this is maybe pretty simplistic, but I would like to say that an American paradigm for a successful city is that you create opportunities for employment, for one, right? And then you have centers of excellence in education, industry, manufacturing, and design plays a big part. Very, very simple formula. Detroit, 1967. Remember the population? 1.8 billion people. Detroit, 2014, 700,000 people. It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. I could recall up until about 1998, I had an interview in Detroit with a group. We were talking about the city, and the guy was telling me, he said that you cannot buy a refrigerator in the city of Detroit. There's no appliance there. There's not one appliance store in the city of Detroit in the late 90s. From the 60s to the 90s, I don't know what it is now, but you could not buy an appliance. So the infrastructure is gone. This is the Packard plant. Packard was a car that was coined a car for kings. It was one of the most incredible cars ever built, Packard. It's gone. History. That's the remnants of Packard. That was from the movie Bullet, 1968, 68. Funny thing, I got a fun story about that. Dodge Charger, that was in that movie. One of the guys that I worked with on the Mustang, Frank Ruff, he goes to Chrysler in 1963. He goes to Chrysler, he works on the Charger. He was one of the designers on the Charger. And the Charger was actually faster than the Mustang. The guy, the stunt driver, had to slow it down. Anyhow, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Danny Burns and the Ford Mustang Club of Acadiana for bringing these wonderful cars here. And I'd like to invite you folks out there to look at those cars. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me, or if you have any questions now, I'd be glad to answer them. And I know these guys would love to talk about their cars. In fact, yes. Go ahead. Sure.
Do you have an opinion of David Halberstam's bestseller, Detroit?
I'm not too familiar with it. There were two guys in it. There's two guys.
Oh,
Yeah. And it's a movie. But I think it's about a 9-minute sequence in the movie. Yeah. And they don't let you do that anymore in San Francisco. Well, it's really been a pleasure. I appreciate your coming here. I really enjoyed your presence, and thank you.